The morning Marcus Chen pulled into his driveway after his night shift at the hospital, the world felt impossibly quiet. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, just a pale promise at the eastern edge of the sky. He sat in his car for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, shoulders still tense from 14 hours of emergency trauma cases. A gunshot wound, 2 car accidents, a fall from a construction site, the usual symphony of human fragility. He was 43 years old, and his back ached in ways that made him feel 60. His ex-wife had taken most of the furniture when she left 3 years ago, but she'd left him the house in Riverside Estates, a modest 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet cul-de-sac where the homes were worth somewhere between $450,000 and $550,000. The kind of neighborhood where nobody made a scene, where everyone kept their lawns mowed and their opinions to themselves. Mostly, the pool had been Sarah's idea, his ex-wife's obsession, really. She wanted a resort-style oasis in the backyard, something to make the neighborhood kids jealous, something to photograph for Instagram. Marcus had installed it 8 years ago, spending $35,000 on a custom 15 by 30-foot saltwater pool with a sun shelf, a small waterfall feature, and pavers that matched the patio. For 3 years, it had been the heart of their entertaining. They'd thrown pool parties every summer. Sarah would float on an inflatable lounger, cocktail in hand, while Marcus stood at the grill. The kids from 3 blocks over would beg their parents to let them come over. Then Sarah left for a tennis instructor named Derek, who apparently appreciated her better. The pool, suddenly, became Marcus's problem. For 5 years after the separation, Marcus had maintained it meticulously, more out of habit than anything else. He'd shock it monthly, kept the pH balanced, replaced the pump when it failed, scrubbed the algae from the tile line at the water line. It was routine, muscle memory, but somewhere in those 5 years, something shifted. He stopped using the pool. He stopped having people over. The pool became less a sanctuary and more a monument to a life that no longer existed. And then, about a year ago, Marcus started thinking about something radical. What if he got rid of it? He'd been eating lunch one afternoon, a sandwich from a container, sitting alone on the back deck, when the thought arrived fully formed like an epiphany. You don't want this pool. You haven't wanted this pool in years. Why are you keeping it? The answer was complicated. Partly it was inertia. Partly it was the nebulous sense that a nice house should have a pool. Partly it was the fear of being perceived as someone who was failing, someone who couldn't maintain what he'd built. But mostly, Marcus realized during that sandwich, it was just trauma held in fiberglass and concrete. Every time he looked at it, he thought about Sarah. He thought about parties he'd rather forget. He thought about trying to be happy and failing. He wanted his backyard back, not Sarah's backyard, his. So Marcus had done what any reasonable person does in 2024. He'd started researching pool removal services. He'd gotten 3 quotes. All of them were expensive, between $12,000 and $18,000 depending on what you wanted done with the concrete pad afterward. But Marcus had decided it was worth it. It was worth every penny to reclaim his space, to make his house feel like his own again. He'd chosen Clearwater Pool Removal because they had the best reviews on Google and they could do the job in a single day. He'd called them on a Tuesday morning. They'd said they could come the following Saturday. That Wednesday evening, Marcus had his new neighbor come by. He didn't know her name yet. She'd moved in 3 months ago to the house directly behind his, just on the other side of the chain-link fence that separated their properties. She was a woman in her mid-50s, he thought, with a kind of perpetually pinched expression that suggested she'd been expecting to be disappointed by life and had not been let down. She had 2 unleashed golden retrievers that were always trying to get through the fence into Marcus's yard. And she had a way of watering her lawn that somehow always involved standing directly on the property line, as if to remind Marcus that the boundary was negotiable if she decided to negotiate it. Her name was Patricia Hoffman, and she arrived at Marcus's back door on Wednesday evening without being invited, holding a casserole dish wrapped in aluminum foil and a look of concerned determination. "I heard," she said without preamble as Marcus opened the door, "that you're having someone remove your pool." Marcus felt a small electrical current run down his spine. He'd gotten 1 quote on Tuesday morning. How could she possibly have? "Word travels fast in Riverside Estates," Patricia continued, pressing past him slightly into the kitchen. "Carol Simmons called me. She said she saw the Clearwater van in your driveway for an estimate." Carol Simmons, of course. Carol lived 2 houses down, and she had a pathological need to know everything about everyone. Marcus had seen her pausing her car outside his house on Monday. as if she'd forgotten something, eyes fixed on his backyard for a full 30 seconds before driving away. "Yeah," Marcus said carefully. "I'm having it removed. It's not something I use anymore." Patricia set the casserole down on his kitchen counter with the air of someone performing an important ritual. "I just want you to know," she said, "that this is going to affect all of us." "Affect you how?" Marcus asked. His tone was still neutral, but he could feel irritation starting to bubble beneath the surface. "It's my pool on my property." "Exactly," Patricia said. "Your property, our neighborhood. These things are connected." She looked at him with the intensity of someone about to deliver a profound truth. "When one of us makes a decision about our home, it sends a message to everyone else. Do you understand what message removing your pool sends?" Marcus had no idea what she was talking about, and his face probably reflected that. "It says that we don't care," Patricia continued. "That Riverside Estates is a place where people don't invest in their homes, where people let things crumble, where we're not maintaining standards." "It's a pool," Marcus said quietly, "not a fundamental pillar of neighborhood character." "Everything is a fundamental pillar of neighborhood character," Patricia replied, and then she turned to leave, pausing at the door to add, "The casserole is zucchini. It's got nuts, so be careful if you have allergies." She left before Marcus could thank her or tell her that she'd made a terrible assumption about his reasons for removing the pool. She left before he could explain that this wasn't about not caring. It was about caring too much about a past he needed to release. Marcus stood in his kitchen for a long moment, looking at the zucchini casserole as if it might spontaneously combust. He put it in the refrigerator and told himself that Patricia Hoffman's opinions about his personal property choices were not his concern. He was wrong about that. The next morning, Marcus woke up earlier than usual. He'd slept poorly, dreams about medical errors that hadn't actually happened, the usual occupational anxiety of someone who worked in trauma. He made coffee and stepped out onto the back patio to check the weather. It was clear, perfect Saturday weather, pool removal weather. That was when he noticed Patricia in her backyard, phone raised, pointed directly at his yard. She was recording something, her body language tense, her lips moving, but no sound carrying across the distance. When she saw him emerge onto the patio, she didn't lower the phone immediately. She let the camera linger on his face for another 2 seconds before finally stopping the recording. Marcus felt a flush of anger move through him, hot and sudden. "Can I help you?" he called out. Patricia didn't respond. She just turned and walked back into her house, her 2 golden retrievers following behind her like courtiers. The Clearwater pool removal team arrived at 8 a.m. sharp on Saturday. 3 men with a truck, a jackhammer, and a containment plan. The team lead was a guy named Derek. Of course his name was Derek, because the universe apparently had a sense of humor, who looked like he'd been removing pools since high school and had made peace with the fact that nobody would ever feel grateful about it. "Gonna take us about 8 hours start to finish," Derek said, looking at the pool with professional assessment. "We'll break it up, haul the debris, pressure wash the pad, and leave everything ready for whatever you want to do next. Patio, lawn, another pool." He said that last part with a slight smile, as if he'd made the joke 1,000 times before. "Just lawn, I think," Marcus said. "Eventually, for now I just want the pad clean." By 9 a.m., Derek had started the jackhammer. The sound was enormous. It was the kind of sound that ate through the Saturday morning quiet and turned the neighborhood into a construction site. The pool concrete cracked apart like eggshell. Dust rose up in a cloud that hung in the still air. Marcus sat inside the house, trying to read on his iPad, but the vibrations ran through the foundation. He could feel the percussion of the jackhammer in his teeth. He made the mistake of looking out the back door around 10 a.m. Patricia was at the property line again, but this time she wasn't alone. She had her phone on a tripod pointed at his backyard, and she was sitting in a lawn chair, watching the destruction as if it were a film festival premiere. When she saw Marcus looking, she raised her phone horizontally and started recording again, panning slowly across the destruction of his pool. Marcus closed the door. He wanted to go out there and ask her what the hell she thought she was doing, but something held him back. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was knowing that any interaction with Patricia at this point would only escalate things. Maybe it was the memory of that casserole, a peace offering that had been anything but peaceful. By 2 p.m., the pool was gone. Where there had been a 15 by 30-foot saltwater rectangle of his past, There was now just a massive concrete pad. The debris was loaded into a truck. Derek's team pressure-washed the pad until it gleamed, and by 4 p.m. the Clearwater van was driving away. Marcus walked out into the backyard and stood in the middle of the empty expanse of concrete. The absence was startling. For 8 years this had been something. Now it was nothing, a blank space, a possibility. He felt lighter, he felt sad, he felt both things at once. That night Marcus made a simple dinner and sat on his back patio as the sun set, turning the empty space into a canvas of gold and pink light. He thought about what he'd do with the space. Maybe he'd put in a garden. Maybe he'd just leave it as a meditation pad, a place to sit and think. He thought about calling his sister. She'd been after him for years to move on, to stop maintaining Sarah's legacy, but decided against it. Some things didn't need to be shared. Some things were just yours. Around midnight, Marcus got a notification on his phone. It was a message to his Ring doorbell camera, a notification that someone had attempted to move it. He checked the video feed and saw Patricia in the dark, trying to angle his doorbell camera so it would face her backyard instead of the street. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. He watched her try 3 times before giving up and disappearing into the night. The next morning, Sunday, Marcus got a lawyer's letter in the mail. It was from a firm called Patterson and Associates, and it was on behalf of Patricia Hoffman. The letter outlined, in clear and formal language, that Patricia Hoffman believed that Marcus Chen's removal of his swimming pool constituted a violation of several covenants related to property values within the Riverside Estates community. It further outlined that Patricia Hoffman had documentation, video documentation, of the removal, and that she intended to file a suit against Marcus for damages related to the diminution of her property value. The damages she was claiming, $87,000. The letter concluded with an invitation for Marcus to contact the law firm to discuss a settlement. Marcus read the letter 3 times, certain that on the 3rd pass it would reveal itself to be a joke, a misunderstanding, some kind of elaborate prank. But the letterhead was real. The law firm's phone number was real. The threat was real. He sat at his kitchen table on a Sunday morning with a letter from a lawyer about a pool that no longer existed, and he wondered, with the kind of clarity that comes from exhaustion and disbelief, how a simple decision about his own property had spiraled so completely into something unrecognizable. Marcus called the law office on Monday morning, his hands shaking slightly as he dialed. He expected to be put on hold, expected to navigate an automated system, expected bureaucratic barriers. Instead, a woman answered on the 2nd ring. Patterson and Associates, this is Brenda. Hi, I'm Marcus Chen. I received a letter from your firm on Sunday regarding Patricia Hoffman and my pool removal. There was a pause. Marcus could hear typing. Oh, yes, Mr. Chen. The woman's tone had shifted, more formal now, less helpful. Ms. Hoffman has retained us to pursue damages for violations of the Riverside Estates covenants and restrictions. Can I ask on what grounds? It's my pool on my property. I removed it. I'll have to have one of our attorneys contact you about the specifics, Brenda said. Is this the best number to reach you? Marcus gave her his number, hung up, and then immediately started researching. The Riverside Estates covenants and restrictions were a document from 1987, filed when the neighborhood was developed. Marcus found a copy on the county recorder's website. He read through pages of prescriptions about mailbox height and lawn maintenance and the color of exterior paint. He read through sections about fence installation and tree removal. He read for 45 minutes before he found what Patricia's lawyer was probably referring to. Article 8, Section 4. Homeowners agree to maintain their residential properties in a manner consistent with the aesthetic standards established within the community. Removal or significant alteration of established residential features without prior approval of the Architectural Review Board may constitute grounds for legal action. Marcus read it again and again. Then he called his brother David, who was a contract lawyer in Sacramento and who would probably tell him this was insane. David answered on the 4th ring, out of breath. Tell me you're not calling with another weird health question, David said. I'm not a doctor. I need legal advice, Marcus said. Even worse, you want free legal advice. Marcus explained the situation. As he talked, he could hear David's skepticism transform into actual concern. Okay, that's weird, David said when Marcus finished. But here's the thing, she probably doesn't have a case. Covenants are typically enforced by the HOA, not by individual homeowners. Does Riverside Estates have an HOA? I don't know. I get a bill every year for community dues, so I guess. Check your paperwork. Find the HOA contact info. If they didn't send you a cease and desist letter about the pool, then Patricia's lawyer is probably just throwing spaghetti at the wall to see if any of it sticks. Marcus felt a small surge of relief. So this is just noise. Probably, David said. But get a lawyer anyway, someone local. Don't ignore this letter, and don't communicate with Patricia directly. Everything goes through counsel, got it? Marcus got it. By Wednesday, he had a lawyer. Her name was Sandra Reeves, and she worked for a mid-sized firm called Reeves and Chen, no relation to Marcus, but the name was reassuring. Sandra was 56 years old, had handled neighborhood disputes before, and had the specific combination of confidence and weariness that came from knowing that people were fundamentally irrational about their property values. She has no case, Sandra said during their first phone call. But she has an HOA that might have concerns, and she has video evidence that you removed the pool, and she has a narrative. Those are dangerous things when combined. What's the narrative? Marcus asked. That you don't care about the neighborhood, that you made a unilateral decision that affects everyone, that property values are more fragile than we'd like to believe, and actions like yours create uncertainty. Sandra paused. Do you have any documentation about why you removed the pool? Just emails with the removal company and my own thoughts. Good, any communications with Patricia? She came to my house once, uninvited, brought a casserole and told me I was damaging the neighborhood. That's good too, Sandra said. It shows premeditation of concern. It shows she knew about it before she started recording. We can use that. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus's backyard became a point of intense neighborhood attention. He noticed it first in small ways, Carol Simmons photographing his yard from her driveway. Someone, he never found out who, leaving anonymous notes in his mailbox about community standards. A Ring doorbell video of Patricia's friends standing at the property line, pointing at the empty concrete pad and shaking their heads. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when Marcus was taking out the trash and found Patricia waiting for him on the sidewalk, phone in hand, a look of deliberate innocence on her face. I'm just documenting the damage, she said before he could say anything, for the lawsuit. This is harassment, Marcus said quietly. Documenting your property is not harassment, Mr. Chen. It's evidence. Marcus went inside and called Sandra. She's building a case in the court of public opinion, Sandra explained. She's documenting everything because she knows the legal case is weak. She's trying to pressure you into settling. Did she threaten you? No, she just said she was documenting damage. Okay, here's what we do. You don't interact with her anymore. You send her written communication only, through me. If she approaches you, you record it and send me the recording. You don't respond to her directly, ever. And we'll send her a cease and desist letter regarding the harassment and the attempted manipulation of your doorbell camera. Sandra sent the cease and desist letter on Friday. Patricia's lawyer responded on Monday with a motion to dismiss the cease and desist on the grounds that documenting a property violation was protected activity, and that Marcus was attempting to silence legitimate neighborhood concerns. The neighborhood sides had formed quickly, Marcus realized. There were people who thought Patricia was ridiculous, overreaching, the kind of person who gave HOAs a bad name. Marcus had coffee with a guy named Tom who lived 2 houses over and who said, "My wife thinks Patricia's completely nuts. She wanted to come over and tell you that we support the pool removal, but I told her that would probably make things worse." But there were also people who seemed to think Patricia had a point. Carol Simmons, of course. A woman named Maureen who lived across the street. A man named Frank who'd somehow gotten the idea that removing a pool was against neighborhood code, even though Frank himself had removed his deck 2 years ago. These people weren't coordinating exactly, but there was a sense of alignment, a shared sense that property values and neighborhood standards were under siege. By early September, 4 weeks after the pool removal, the HOA got involved. Marcus received notice that the Riverside Estates Homeowners Association wanted to conduct an architectural review of the pool removal. They wanted to know why he hadn't submitted an architectural review request before removing the structure. They wanted to know what his plans were for the concrete pad. They wanted him to appear at their next meeting to explain his actions. Sandra's response was immediate and firm. They're too late. Architectural review boards have a timeline to respond to proposed changes. You didn't submit a request, but that's actually better for us. It means they can't retroactively punish you for removing the pool. Send them a letter saying you'll appear at the meeting, but only with representation. The HOA meeting was scheduled for the third Thursday of September. The meeting was held in the community center, a bland room with folding chairs arranged in rows, the kind of space that seemed designed for exactly this kind of tedious neighborhood conflict. Marcus arrived with Sandra at 7 p.m. and found about 40 people already seated, which was more than he would have expected for an HOA meeting about a pool. The HOA president was a man named Robert Chen, actually related to Marcus, distantly. They'd discovered they'd been at the same family reunion in 1994, but had never spoken. Robert looked uncomfortable about this entire situation, probably because he could sense the litigiousness already forming, the way these things had of spiraling. We're here tonight to discuss the architectural status of 847 Clemson Drive, Robert said, reading from notes. Specifically, the removal of an in-ground swimming pool without prior architectural review. Mr. Marcus Chen is here to explain his actions. Marcus stood, Sandra beside him, and began to explain that the pool removal had been a personal property decision, that it was his own pool on his own property, that he'd engaged a licensed contractor to remove it safely and professionally. He was cut off by Patricia, who stood without being recognized and said, "The point is not whether he had the right to remove it. The point is what it means for all of us. The point is that when one property value indicator disappears, everyone's property value goes down. We should have had a say in this." "That's not how property ownership works," Sandra said mildly. "Homeowners have the right to make modifications to their own property." "Not when it affects me," Patricia said. "My property backs up to his decision affects my life." "Your property value might appreciate," Sandra replied, "if he installs something else, or it might not change at all. But you don't have a legal right to control what he does on his own land." Robert tried to regain control of the meeting. "The question before the board is whether the pool removal constitutes a violation of our covenants." "It does," Patricia said. "He modified his property without approval." "The covenant says established residential features," Sandra interjected. "A pool is a feature, yes, but removing a feature is not the same as adding one. The board would typically have the right to review additions to a property, not removals." Robert looked at his other HOA board members. They seemed collectively uncertain. One of them, a woman named Susan, said, "I think the spirit of the covenant is about maintaining neighborhood standards. Removing a pool might be seen as a reduction in neighborhood appeal." "Spirit of the covenant," Sandra repeated, "is not the same as letter of the covenant. Unless the letter specifically forbids pool removal, the board doesn't have grounds to take action." The meeting went on for another 40 minutes. It was clear that the HOA board was conflicted. They didn't want to get sued. They also didn't want Patricia to feel like they were siding against her. They seemed to want to find some kind of compromise, some middle ground that didn't exist. Robert finally said, "The board will take this under advisement and render a decision within 30 days. Next item." As Marcus and Sandra were leaving, Patricia approached them. She was alone without her lawyer. "You can win this if you want," she said to Marcus quietly. "But you'll lose the neighborhood. People won't forget this. You'll be the guy who destroyed property values. You'll be the guy who doesn't care about the community." "I'm the guy who removed my own pool," Marcus said. "Same thing," Patricia replied. In the parking lot, Sandra said, "She's right about one thing. You will lose the neighborhood. That's the real punishment here, not the lawsuit, not the HOA decision. It's the social cost. She's making you toxic." "So what do I do?" Marcus asked. "You wait for the HOA decision, and then, depending on what they say, we figure out our next move. But Marcus," Sandra paused, "be prepared for the possibility that you might win legally but lose in every other way." The HOA rendered their decision 28 days later, by email, signed by Robert Chen himself. The decision stated that while the board had concerns about the pool removal, the removal did not technically violate the language of the Architectural Review Covenant. Therefore, no action would be taken. However, the board suggested that Marcus consider installing a complementary feature in the space, landscaping or a small gazebo, to address neighborhood concerns about the property's appearance. It was a victory. It was also, as Sandra had predicted, completely meaningless. Because the day after the HOA decision, Patricia filed a small claims suit against Marcus in her own name, arguing that the pool removal had diminished her property value by the amount of $87,000 and demanding damages. "She's going to lose," Sandra said when she called with the news. "But she's going to make you go to court to prove it. She's going to make you spend time and money and emotional energy on a case she can't win. That's the point. The point is to make you regret ever removing that pool." Marcus sat at his kitchen table and thought about his backyard. He thought about the lightness he'd felt when the jackhammer stopped and the pool was finally gone. He thought about how that lightness had slowly been replaced by a different kind of weight, not the weight of Sarah's legacy anymore, but the weight of Patricia's obsession. He looked out at the empty concrete pad, now less a symbol of his freedom and more a symbol of a mistake he couldn't undo. Small claims court in the county courthouse was exactly what Marcus had expected. Fluorescent lit, efficiently depressing, run by a judge named Harriet Morrison who'd clearly heard 1,000 versions of this same conflict and had the exhausted patience of someone who'd given up on expecting people to be reasonable. The hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday in mid-October. Marcus arrived early with Sandra, who'd agreed to represent him despite small claims court typically allowing parties to represent themselves. The courtroom held about 30 chairs. By the time the hearing was about to start, it was packed. Carol Simmons was there. Tom and his wife were there. Patricia's friends were there. It was a neighborhood theater production, and Marcus was the antagonist. Patricia arrived with her lawyer, a man named Douglas Hayes who had the kind of expensive haircut that suggested he wasn't usually in small claims court, and definitely wasn't planning to lose. He wore a suit that probably cost more than the entire dispute. Judge Morrison called the case. Hoffman versus Chen, pool removal damages. Ms. Hoffman, you're the plaintiff, so you'll present first. Patricia stood. She was wearing a blazer and nice slacks, and her expression was carefully neutral, the expression of someone who'd been coached to look reasonable rather than vindictive. Douglas Hayes stood beside her. "Your Honor," Patricia began, "I've lived in Riverside Estates for 3 years. I purchased my home based on the neighborhood's reputation for stability and property value maintenance. My property backs directly up to the defendant's property. This summer, without any consideration for the impact on surrounding homes, Mr. Chen removed his in-ground pool. This removal has directly impacted the aesthetic value of the neighborhood and has consequentially impacted my property value. I'm asking for $87,000 in damages to compensate for the diminution of value caused by his actions." Judge Morrison looked at Marcus. "Your response." Marcus stood. Sandra had coached him. "Be direct. Be calm. Don't get emotional. Don't attack Patricia." "Your Honor, I removed my pool because I no longer used it. The pool was on my property. Removing a feature from your own property does not violate any law or regulation. It doesn't affect Ms. Hoffman's property value. If anything, my having an open concrete pad gives me an opportunity to improve my property in ways that could potentially increase its value. Ms. Hoffman doesn't have standing to sue me for making decisions about my own home." Judge Morrison nodded. "Okay, Ms. Hoffman, you'll need to prove that the removal of your neighbor's pool directly caused a measurable diminution in your property value. How do you propose to do that?" Douglas Hayes stood. "Your Honor, we've retained a property appraiser who has reviewed the neighborhood and compared property values before and after the pool removal. We also have documentation of similar neighborhood disputes and their impact on surrounding property values. We can show a clear causal relationship between the removal of this amenity and the diminishment of value for adjacent properties." "That seems like a pretty big burden of proof," Judge Morrison said. "How does removing his pool diminish her property value? Her backyard still exists. Her house hasn't changed." "Buyer perception," Douglas said. "When a neighborhood shows signs of disinvestment." "Removing a pool isn't disinvestment," Judge Morrison interrupted. "Disinvestment would be if the property was in disrepair. But according to what I've heard, the property is maintained, the concrete pad is clean and professionally managed. The defendant is simply not using one particular amenity anymore." Douglas looked slightly less confident. He continued with his argument, but the momentum had shifted. Sandra presented their case next. She brought documentation showing that Patricia had approached Marcus before the removal with specific concerns about the pool being removed. evidence of premeditation in the lawsuit. She brought evidence that pools were frequently removed from properties in the neighborhood without causing any measurable property value changes. She brought a property appraiser, a woman named Dr. Helen Martinez, who testified that there was no evidence of a causal relationship between the pool removal and any diminution of Patricia's property value. In fact, Dr. Martinez said, property values in this neighborhood have remained stable over the past 6 months. If anything, they've slightly increased due to general market conditions. There's no data to suggest that a single pool removal has caused any measurable change. Judge Morrison asked Patricia's appraiser to be cross-examined. The appraiser, a nervous man named Victor Strand, had to admit that he hadn't actually run a formal property appraisal of Patricia's home since before the pool removal. He'd made assumptions about value loss based on market perception concerns, which wasn't actually an appraisal methodology. By the time closing arguments rolled around, it was clear that Patricia's case had significant problems. But Douglas Hayes was a skilled lawyer, and he knew how to work the emotional angle. Your Honor, we're not just asking you to consider hard numbers here. We're asking you to consider the principle that homeowners have a right to know that their neighbors will maintain neighborhood standards. We're asking you to consider the fact that when one homeowner unilaterally decides to remove an amenity, other homeowners should have a voice. Ms. Hoffman isn't suing because she's mean or petty. She's suing because she's trying to maintain the value and character of her community. Judge Morrison looked at him over her glasses. She's suing because she disagreed with her neighbor's property decision. That's not illegal, Mr. Hayes, nor is the property decision itself. Judge Morrison took a 30-minute recess, then returned with her decision. I'm ruling in favor of the defendant, she said. The plaintiff has not established a causal relationship between the removal of the defendant's pool and any measurable diminution of the plaintiff's property value. Property removal, unlike property addition, is generally a homeowner's prerogative and is not subject to neighbor approval. The case is dismissed with prejudice. Neither party may bring this suit again. Patricia's face went pale. Douglas Hayes started to say something, but Judge Morrison cut him off. That's my ruling, next case. Marcus felt Sandra's hand briefly touch his elbow, a gesture of professional satisfaction. As they were leaving the courtroom, he felt the weight of the neighborhood's eyes on him. He'd won. He'd proven that Patricia had no legal standing, but her gaze, as it followed him out of the room, suggested that this wasn't over. In the courthouse hallway, Douglas Hayes approached Sandra, and they had a brief conversation that Marcus couldn't quite hear. When Sandra came back to him, her expression had shifted. Patricia's lawyer just told me that Patricia is planning to appeal the decision, Sandra said quietly. It's unlikely to succeed, but appeals cost money and time. He also said there's talk about filing a complaint with the state licensing board about the pool removal contractor, claiming they didn't get proper permits. Did they need permits? Marcus asked. Probably. I'll have to check with the contractor. If they did need permits and didn't get them, that's actually a problem for you, not Patricia, but it's something we need to investigate. Marcus went home that afternoon with a sense of victory hollowed out by the knowledge that the conflict had acquired its own momentum. He'd won a court case, but he hadn't won the neighborhood. Patricia had lost, but she hadn't given up. That evening, he did something he probably shouldn't have done. He walked to Patricia's house and knocked on her door. She answered after a moment, looking surprised. Before she could say anything, Marcus said, I won the case. The judge dismissed your suit. You don't have a legal standing to sue me for removing my pool. I know, Patricia said calmly. My lawyer explained it. We're appealing. Why? Marcus asked. Why are you doing this? Patricia looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and almost sad. Because I moved to this neighborhood to have stability. I spent my entire adult life moving from place to place. My ex-husband's job, this town then that town, never putting down roots. When I finally bought this house, I wanted it to mean something. I wanted it to be a place where things didn't change without reason. And then you removed your pool, and it felt like the ground underneath me shifted. Like nothing was stable, like anywhere could change at any moment. Marcus felt a sudden shift in his understanding of the situation. This wasn't about property values or neighborhood standards or even neighborhood spite. This was about Patricia's trauma, her need for control, her fear of instability expressing itself through a lawsuit about a pool. I'm sorry, Marcus said, and he meant it. I didn't know that's what this was about. Well, Patricia said, Now you do. But that doesn't change the fact that the pool is gone and I'm still here. Marcus went home and called Sandra. I think I might be able to settle this, he said. She just lost a case, Sandra said. Why would she settle? She's going to appeal. Because the real issue isn't legal, Marcus said. The real issue is that she's scared. She's scared of change. She's scared of instability. The lawsuit is just how she's expressing that fear. There was a pause. Okay, Sandra said slowly. What do you want to do? Marcus made an offer that Patricia would accept. He'd work with an architect to design a landscaping project for the concrete pad. He'd use it to create a small meditation garden, not elaborate but thoughtful, something beautiful. He'd give Patricia a tour of the plans before he built it. He'd allow her to have a voice in what filled the space where the pool had been. He'd also offer to pay half her legal fees, not as a settlement on the suit, which he'd already won, but as a gesture of good faith. Patricia accepted the offer within 24 hours. The appeal was quietly withdrawn. Over the next 6 weeks, Marcus worked with an architect named Jennifer Wu to design a garden. It was small, just the central area of the concrete pad. Rock pathways, a water feature, a small fountain, not a pool, low-maintenance plants, a wooden bench under a shade structure, nothing dramatic, nothing that would make the neighborhood sit up and notice, something that was just for Marcus and that Patricia, looking from her backyard, would see and recognize as an attempt at peace. When it was finished, Marcus invited Patricia over to see it. She came with her 2 golden retrievers and they walked through the garden together. She didn't say much, just nodded at the design choices, touched the plants, listened to the sound of the fountain. It's nice, she finally said. It's actually really nice. I'm glad, Marcus said. I'm sorry, Patricia added, and Marcus realized that she meant it. That the lawsuit, the recording, the casserole that was supposed to be a warning, all of it had been her fear acting out, and now she was embarrassed by what she'd done. It's okay, Marcus said. We're okay now. But as Patricia was leaving, as she walked back to her house with her golden retrievers, Marcus realized that they weren't actually okay. They were just finished fighting. And sometimes that's the only kind of okay you can get. 3 months after the garden was installed, Marcus sat in his backyard on a Saturday morning, reading a novel and drinking his 3rd cup of coffee. The weather was perfect. One of those late autumn days where the temperature is exactly right, and the light has that golden quality that made you want to be outside for no particular reason. The garden had become a real thing. The plants had taken root. The fountain had weathered its first real freeze without damage. The shade structure looked less new and slightly more like it had always been there. It was the kind of space that invited sitting and thinking, which was exactly what it was designed to do. Marcus heard the gate open. He looked up, mildly curious, and found Tom from 2 houses over walking through, followed by Tom's wife, Ellen. Hey man, Tom said. Ellen's been wanting to see the famous garden that solved a neighborhood war. Marcus laughed despite himself. Word gets around, huh? Everything gets around in Riverside Estates, Ellen said. She was younger than Tom by about 10 years and had kind eyes. We heard about the lawsuit. We also heard you actually won. And then we heard you built this. Tom and Ellen spent 20 minutes looking around the garden, making genuine comments about the design choices, asking questions about how Marcus had conceptualized the space. It was the kind of normal neighborhood interaction that Marcus had been missing, people being kind just because they wanted to be, not because they were taking sides in a conflict. It's really beautiful, Ellen said. And honestly, Patricia seems happier. I don't know if it's this or if it's something else, but she seems lighter somehow. After Tom and Ellen left, Marcus thought about what Ellen had said. He'd been so focused on winning the lawsuit, on vindicating his right to make decisions about his own property, that he hadn't actually thought about what Patricia might be feeling. The lawsuit had been, he realized, less about the pool and more about Patricia trying to assert control over a situation that felt uncontrollable to her. And in building the garden, in involving her in the creative process, Marcus had inadvertently given her something better than a lawsuit victory. He'd given her the sense that her concerns had mattered. The following week, Patricia knocked on his door. It was the first time she'd done so without legal documentation in hand or ulterior motives visible on her face. I wanted to invite you to a neighborhood dinner, she said. I'm organizing it for next Saturday, nothing fancy, just some people from the street. Carol, Susan, Frank, people who have been here a while. I thought it might be nice to have everyone together. Marcus's first instinct was to decline. His second instinct was to assume it was a trap. His third instinct, which he eventually acted on, was to accept. The dinner was at Patricia's house, and it was genuinely pleasant. There were 8 people around her dining room table, eating a pasta that Patricia had made herself, drinking wine that someone had brought, and having conversations that had nothing to do with property values or neighborhood disputes. Carol, Marcus discovered, was actually funny when she wasn't being a neighborhood spy. Frank had opinions about classic rock that Marcus found refreshingly passionate. Susan was an artist and spent the evening describing a project she was working on, a series of paintings about the history of the neighborhoods in the city. Toward the end of the dinner, as people were having coffee and dessert, Patricia stood and asked if she could say something. Everyone turned to her, and Marcus felt a moment of anxiety. Was she going to take back her apology? Was this an elaborate setup? "I want to apologize," Patricia said simply, looking at Marcus. "I behaved badly. I was scared, and I handled that fear in ways that weren't kind or reasonable. I sued my neighbor over a pool, which is frankly ridiculous when I say it out loud. But Marcus handled it gracefully, and he built something beautiful in his yard that has reminded me that sometimes the best way to resolve conflict is to create something new rather than fight over what's gone." There was a moment of quiet, then Carol raised her glass. "I'll drink to that," she said, "and also to the garden. That thing looks legitimately nice." Over the following months, as winter settled in and then as spring began to arrive, Marcus's relationship with the neighborhood shifted. He was still the guy who removed his pool, but he was no longer the guy who ruined the neighborhood. He was just Marcus, who'd made a property decision that had initially caused conflict, but had ultimately led to something thoughtful and beautiful. Patricia's interest in his backyard shifted from surveillance to genuine appreciation. She'd occasionally text him photos of the garden from different seasons: snow on the rocks, spring flowers beginning to bloom, the way the fountain looked at different times of day. It wasn't quite friendship, but it was something closer to respect. The HOA meeting in December was uneventful. Robert Chen reported that property values in Riverside Estates had actually increased slightly over the year. He mentioned Marcus's garden project as an example of creative neighborhood response to property changes. No one objected. No one brought up the pool. On New Year's Eve, Marcus was sitting in his living room, thinking about the year that had passed and how strange it was that a simple property decision had led to such complicated consequences. His brother David called, slightly drunk and expansive. "How's the pool situation?" David asked. "Did Patricia ever stop harassing you?" "It worked out," Marcus said. "We're on good terms now." "Because you built a garden." "Because I listened to what she was actually asking for underneath the lawsuit. She wasn't really upset about the pool. She was scared that the world was unstable. The garden gave her something to hold on to." "So you gave her a garden to avoid further litigation?" David laughed. "That's the weirdest mediation I've ever heard." "Welcome to neighborhood disputes," Marcus said. The following spring, on the anniversary of the pool removal, Marcus was sitting in the garden when Patricia appeared at the gate. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" she asked. "Of course," Marcus said. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the fountain, watching the spring sunlight filter through the leaves of the trees that were just beginning to fully leaf out. "I've been thinking," Patricia said, "about selling the house." Marcus felt a moment of concern. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine," Patricia said. "Actually better than fine. But I realized that I moved here looking for stability, and I've come to understand that stability isn't something you find in a place. It's something you build inside yourself. So I'm thinking about selling and traveling for a bit, seeing some of the places I never got to see because I was always moving for someone else's job or stuck in someone else's fear." "That sounds amazing," Marcus said, and meant it. "It's because of what happened with the pool," Patricia said. "It sounds weird, but the lawsuit, and then you building the garden, and then me realizing how I'd acted, it cracked something open in me. Made me question why I was so desperate to control everything. So I'm grateful for it in a strange way. Does that make sense?" "It does," Marcus said. Patricia sold her house 3 months later. The new neighbors were younger, a couple with 2 kids, both of whom immediately noticed the garden and asked Marcus if he'd teach them about the plants. Marcus did, and suddenly the garden became a neighborhood gathering place. Kids would come over to see the fountain. Neighbors would text to ask what plant was blooming at different times of year. The space that had started as Marcus's attempt at reconciliation became something that belonged to the whole street. On the last day before Patricia's move, she brought Marcus a small plant in a ceramic pot. "For the garden," she said, "I thought you should have one plant that I chose, so you'll remember that sometimes the worst conflicts can become the most important moments." After she left, Marcus placed the plant, a butterfly bush, in the center of the garden, where it would be visible from her old house. He sat on the bench and thought about how strange life was, how you never knew when a simple decision was going to spiral into something complex and painful, and how sometimes the way out of pain was just to build something beautiful. The lawsuit became a story that the neighborhood told and retold, but the specific details gradually changed. Within a year, it became the time Patricia sued Marcus over the garden, which wasn't quite accurate but was close enough to the emotional truth. Within 2 years, it had become remember when Patricia tried to sue over the pool removal, and younger neighbors who'd recently moved in would listen with the particular interest people have in neighborhood folklore. Marcus received a postcard from Patricia about a year after she'd moved, from a beach in Costa Rica. On the back, she'd written, "The garden saved my life. Thank you for understanding what I needed better than I understood it myself." He put the postcard on his refrigerator, and it stayed there, yellowing slightly, becoming part of his home's landscape just as the garden had become part of his backyard's landscape. 2 years after the initial pool removal, Marcus received an unexpected email from a journalist named Rachel Kim, who worked for a podcast called Neighborhood Conflicts. The podcast examined the specific ways that property disputes revealed larger truths about community, fear, and the human need for control. Rachel had somehow heard about Marcus and Patricia's story through the neighborhood grapevine, and she wanted to feature it on an episode. Marcus's first instinct was to decline. He'd moved on from the conflict, and he didn't particularly want to relitigate it in public. But he called David, who said, "Actually, this might be good for you. This is your story. You should be the one telling it." The podcast interview was recorded over Zoom, and Rachel turned out to be a genuinely skilled interviewer. She asked Marcus questions that went deeper than the surface-level lawsuit story. She asked him about why he'd removed the pool in the first place. She asked him about the moment when he realized Patricia's lawsuit wasn't really about property values. She asked him about the decision to build the garden instead of fighting further. "I think the hardest part," Marcus found himself saying, "was understanding that Patricia wasn't actually my enemy. She was a person who was scared, and fear makes people do things that don't make sense to anyone except the person who's scared. The real vindication wasn't winning the lawsuit. The real vindication was understanding what she actually needed and finding a way to give it to her without sacrificing my own integrity." The podcast episode dropped on a Wednesday evening. Within 48 hours, it had been listened to by over 100,000 people. Within a week, it had been shared extensively on social media, with clips going viral of Marcus explaining his reasoning for the pool removal and his decision to extend grace to Patricia rather than continue fighting. The comments were interesting. Some people called him too nice, too willing to bend to his neighbors' demands. Some people called him a saint. Most people seemed genuinely moved by the story, especially the part about building the garden and Patricia's eventual transformation. One comment, though, came from someone named James Patterson, who identified himself as the lawyer from the HOA's Architectural Review Board. He wrote, "This is the kind of conflict resolution we need more of. I was at that HOA meeting, and I have to say that the way Marcus handled it with grace and creativity was exactly what neighborhoods need. The lawsuit was frivolous, but the way he turned the conflict into an opportunity for understanding, that's the real story." Rachel followed up with Marcus about the podcast's response. She asked if he'd be willing to do a follow-up episode, maybe with Patricia joining remotely. Marcus was hesitant. Patricia had moved on, and he didn't want to drag her back into something she'd worked hard to put behind her. But Rachel explained that she'd already reached out to Patricia, and Patricia had said she'd be interested in participating. The follow-up episode was recorded about a month later, with Patricia calling in from Costa Rica, where she was now spending several months a year. The conversation between Marcus and Patricia was different from Marcus's solo interview, less about property and law, more about the actual human experience of conflict and reconciliation. "I was so afraid," Patricia said at one point, her voice crackling slightly through the internet connection. "I was afraid of change, of instability, of the ground shifting beneath me, and when Marcus removed his pool, it triggered all of that fear at once. I thought if I could just prove that he was wrong, if I could win a lawsuit, then everything would feel stable again. But of course it didn't work that way. The only thing that actually helped was realizing that stability is internal. It's not something you can fight for or win in court. Did you expect him to build a garden? Rachel asked. No, Patricia said. I expected him to fight back harder. I expected him to defend himself, to point out how unreasonable I was being. What I didn't expect was for him to actually try to understand what I needed. That was unprecedented in my life experience. The follow-up episode was even more successful than the first. It got picked up by a larger podcast network. Local news outlets started reaching out to Marcus for interviews. A lawyer association asked him to speak on a panel about neighborhood dispute resolution. An HOA magazine wanted to run an article about his experience. Marcus found the attention slightly overwhelming, but David encouraged him to embrace it. You've got a platform now, David said. Use it to say something meaningful about how neighborhoods work, about how people interact, about the importance of empathy in resolving conflict. Marcus did a few interviews, and he tried to make them substantive. He talked about how property disputes are rarely really about property. He talked about how fear is often the root cause of conflict. He talked about how creative problem-solving is sometimes more effective than legal victories. One of those interviews was with a journalist for the Times, and the article ran in the home section under the headline, "When a Pool Removal Becomes a Lesson in Conflict Resolution." It was a thoughtful piece that positioned Marcus not as a saint, but as someone who'd simply chosen to engage with his neighbor's fear rather than dismiss it. The article caught the attention of a documentary filmmaker named Susan Martinez, who'd been working on a project about neighborhoods in America. She reached out to Marcus asking if he'd be willing to be featured in a documentary about neighborhood dynamics and conflict resolution. Your story is perfect, Susan explained during a phone call. It's not about people being unreasonable. It's about people being human. It's about how we create our own stories about property and status and stability, and how those stories can either divide us or unite us depending on how we choose to respond. Marcus agreed. Over the next 3 months, Susan filmed in Riverside Estates. She interviewed Marcus extensively. She also interviewed Patricia, Tom and Ellen, Carol Simmons, Sandra, his lawyer, and several other neighbors. She got footage of the garden from all seasons. She filmed the community center where the HOA meeting had happened. She created something that was genuinely moving, not a documentary about a lawsuit, but a meditation on how ordinary people navigate conflict and connection. The documentary premiered at a film festival and then was picked up by a streaming service. Within a few months of its release, it became a phenomenon. People were talking about it online. Neighborhood associations were screening it at their meetings. Marriage counselors were recommending it to couples who were stuck in patterns of conflict. Patricia called Marcus from Southeast Asia, where she was now traveling, and she was laughing. Did you know that "Removed My Pool" has been trending on Twitter? She asked. People are posting photos of their backyards and telling their own neighborhood conflict stories. We've somehow become meme-adjacent. Marcus had indeed seen the Twitter trend, and it was both hilarious and somehow genuinely moving. People were sharing real stories about neighborhood conflicts and how they'd resolved them. There were stories about fences, about parking spots, about noise disputes, about yards and gardens and shared walls. There was something cathartic about it, something that suggested that these conflicts were universal, and that solutions existed if you were willing to be creative and empathetic. About 6 months after the documentary premiered, Marcus received a notification that his story had been included in a curriculum developed for conflict resolution education in schools. The curriculum was being piloted in 5 school districts across the state, teaching high school students about how to navigate disagreements, how to understand other people's perspectives, how to find creative solutions rather than just winning arguments. He was invited to speak at one of the schools where they were using the curriculum. He walked into a high school auditorium and found about 300 teenagers sitting there, and he thought about how strange it was that his story with Patricia had somehow become something that was supposed to teach kids about empathy. During the Q&A after his talk, a girl raised her hand and asked, "Aren't you angry that she sued you? Doesn't it feel like she won because you gave her what she wanted?" Marcus thought about that question carefully. "I think that's how it might seem from the outside," he said. "But anger keeps you trapped in a situation. In order to actually resolve a conflict, you have to get curious about the other person. You have to ask yourself, Why is this person acting this way? What are they actually afraid of? And once you ask those questions, the conflict looks different. It's not about winning and losing anymore. It's about whether you want to stay angry or whether you want to actually fix the relationship. But what if you don't want to fix the relationship? Another student asked. Then you're entitled to not fix it, Marcus said. But you've still got to live next to that person. You've still got to see them. You've still got to navigate the reality that you're part of the same community. And from my perspective, once I understood that, it seemed like a waste of energy to stay in conflict. The auditorium was quiet for a moment, and then a lot of hands went up. Students had so many questions about property rights, about justice, about fairness, about how to stand up for yourself without alienating others. Marcus spent an hour answering questions, and it struck him that these were exactly the kinds of questions that had been at the heart of his conflict with Patricia. After the presentation, a teacher named Mr. Rodriguez approached Marcus and said, "Thank you for this. You have no idea how much students need to hear that resolution doesn't have to mean surrender." Driving home that day, Marcus thought about how the simple act of removing his pool had somehow become a teaching moment for hundreds of teenagers. He thought about how Patricia's lawsuit, which had felt so devastating at the time, had ultimately contributed to something positive, a framework for thinking about conflict differently. He wondered what Patricia would say about all of this. He reached out to her, and she was delighted to hear that their story had become educational material. She was, she said, currently planning a nonprofit organization related to conflict resolution and community building, inspired directly by their experience together. "I'm not running from things anymore," she told Marcus over a video call. "I'm building toward things, and I have you to thank for that." "I think we can thank each other," Marcus said. That night, Marcus sat in the garden. The butterfly bush that Patricia had given him was in full bloom, attracting actual butterflies. The fountain was running. The spring evening was perfect, cool but not cold, with the smell of new growth in the air. He thought about how the story of his conflict with Patricia had become something bigger than the two of them. He thought about the thousands of people who'd listened to the podcast, who'd watched the documentary, who'd read the articles. He thought about the high school students who now understood that conflict was an opportunity, that empathy was a strength, that the goal wasn't to win, but to create understanding. The real vindication, Marcus realized, wasn't about the lawsuit or the legal victory or even the garden. The real vindication was about having taken a situation that could have spiraled into years of resentment and neighbor feuds, and having transformed it into something that actually mattered, something that helped people understand themselves better. He pulled out his phone and texted Patricia, "Thank you for suing me." She responded within minutes, "Thank you for not fighting back." 4 years after the initial pool removal, Marcus was invited to speak at the annual conference of the American Association of Homeowners Associations. The title of his talk was From Conflict to Connection, Reframing Neighborhood Disputes as Community Opportunities. He was paid an honorarium, his travel was covered, and he was put up in a nice hotel in a city 2 hours away. He almost didn't go. It felt strange to have turned a personal experience into a commodity, to be a professional speaker about something that had originally just been a mistake and then a mess. But David encouraged him again. "You've earned this," David said, "and you might actually help people." At the conference, Marcus gave his talk in front of about 500 people, HOA board members, property managers, conflict mediators, and community leaders from across the country. He told the story chronologically. He didn't edit out his own doubts or Patricia's initial unreasonableness. He told it as it had happened, a cascade of decisions and reactions that could have ended in permanent neighborhood division, but had instead ended in transformation. The response was overwhelming. During the Q&A, people asked detailed questions about his legal strategy, about his decision-making process, about how he'd known when to fight and when to extend grace. During the break after his talk, people lined up to shake his hand, to tell him their own stories, to ask for his advice about their own neighborhood conflicts. One of those people was a woman named Margaret Chen, no relation, who was the executive director of an organization called the National Conflict Resolution Center. She pulled Marcus aside after the talk ended and said, "I want to offer you something. We're developing a certification program for conflict resolution specialists, and I'd like you to consider becoming one of our master trainers." "I'm a trauma doctor," Marcus said, "not a conflict specialist." "You're someone who understands people," Margaret replied. You're someone who sees past the surface of a conflict to what's actually happening underneath. That's a skill that can be taught, and you'd be good at teaching it. Think about it. Marcus did think about it. He thought about it over his drive home. He thought about it over the next week. He called David and asked what he thought, and David said, "I think you've accidentally found what you're supposed to be doing with your life." Marcus started the conflict resolution certification program while still maintaining his trauma surgeon position at the hospital. The program involved intensive training in mediation, negotiation, understanding the psychological roots of conflict, and creative problem-solving. It involved case studies, role-playing, practicing difficult conversations with other trainees. It was the hardest educational thing Marcus had ever done, partly because it required him to confront his own patterns of conflict and communication. The case study that was used most frequently in the training program, Marcus eventually realized, was his own story with Patricia. Master trainers would break the situation down and examine it from multiple angles. They'd ask trainees what they would have done differently. They'd discuss the decision points where Marcus could have escalated or retreated, and why he'd chosen instead to build the garden. 6 months into the certification program, Marcus was attending a training session as an observer, watching a master trainer named Dr. Paul Gonzalez use the Marcus-Patricia case to teach about turning conflict into opportunity. A trainee raised her hand and asked, "But what if you're in the right and the other person is completely unreasonable? Do you still have to validate their feelings?" "Validity isn't about right and wrong," Dr. Gonzalez said. "It's about acknowledgement. Even if someone is wrong legally or factually, they're still having a real experience." Patricia was wrong about the lawsuit, the judge confirmed that, but her fear was absolutely real, and Marcus understood that. That understanding became the bridge to resolution. Marcus got certified as a conflict resolution specialist after completing the intensive program and passing both written and practical exams. He then started working with the National Conflict Resolution Center as a part-time trainer, teaching mediation workshops and developing case studies. He kept his position at the hospital. He wasn't ready to leave trauma surgery, but he reduced his hours to make time for the training work. What surprised him most was how much the two careers complemented each other. In trauma surgery, you learn to think quickly, to assess situations rapidly, to make decisions under pressure. In conflict resolution, you learn to slow down, to listen deeply, to resist the urge to react immediately. Together, they created a kind of balance in how he moved through the world. 5 years after the pool removal, Marcus received a letter from Patricia. She was back in the United States, living in San Diego, and she was writing because she wanted to tell Marcus something important. She'd been diagnosed with cancer, and she expected it to be a long road, but expected to survive it. She was writing because she wanted him to know that their conflict and their resolution had fundamentally changed how she faced challenges. "I used to respond to difficulty by trying to control things," she wrote. "When you removed the pool, I panicked and tried to sue you. But through that process, and through rebuilding with you afterward, I learned that sometimes you have to let go of control and trust that things will work out. That's what I'm doing now with the cancer. I'm not fighting it with anger. I'm facing it with the same kind of grace and curiosity that you faced our conflict with. And honestly, I think that might save my life in ways that a different attitude wouldn't." Marcus read that letter several times. He showed it to David, who got teary-eyed. He shared it with Margaret Chen and the other trainers at the Conflict Resolution Center because it seemed to capture something essential about why this work mattered. He never heard from Patricia again, not because anything bad happened. He eventually got a message from Tom's wife Ellen, who'd stayed in touch with Patricia, that Patricia had beaten the cancer and was doing well. But Patricia's work was done. She'd done what she needed to do, which was to transform her fear into wisdom. Marcus had done what he needed to do, which was to respond to someone's fear with compassion instead of defensiveness. 3 years later, in the 9th year after the pool removal, Marcus stood in front of a gathering at a new housing development called Riverside Estates 2. Apparently, the developer had decided to name it after the original neighborhood, which made Marcus smile. He was there to talk about conflict resolution to the residents of this new community. The developer had invited him specifically, hoping that his presence and his story would set a different tone for this neighborhood than the one that had emerged from the Patricia-Marcus conflict. During his talk, Marcus emphasized something that had become central to his philosophy. Every conflict is an opportunity for deeper understanding if you choose to see it that way. Property disputes, boundary disputes, noise disputes, They're all underneath, about people trying to maintain a sense of safety and control in their lives. When you understand that, you can respond with compassion instead of defensiveness. After the talk, a man approached Marcus and said, "I'm planning to have my garden removed next spring. I'm not using it anymore. Based on your story, I'm expecting someone will sue me." Marcus laughed. "Maybe, maybe not, but if they do, you'll know how to handle it now." Driving home that day, Marcus had what felt like a profound realization. The pool removal had never actually been about the pool. It had been about him trying to reclaim his life from his ex-wife's legacy. Patricia's lawsuit had never actually been about the pool either. It had been about her trying to maintain control over a world that felt chaotic. The whole conflict had been about two people expressing their deepest fears through the medium of property. And the resolution hadn't come through legal victory or property rights. It had come through him understanding that Patricia's fear was valid, even if her lawsuit wasn't. The resolution had come through him finding a creative way to address her underlying need instead of just defending his legal position. That night, Marcus sat in the garden and filmed a short video for the National Conflict Resolution Center's new online platform. He sat on the bench, with the fountain running behind him, with the butterfly bush in bloom, and he talked directly to the camera. "People often ask me if I regret removing the pool. The answer is no. But I also don't regret the lawsuit or the conflict or even the time I spent angry at my neighbor for suing me. Because that whole process taught me something essential. Conflict isn't a failure of communication. Conflict is a signal that two people need something different from the same situation, and they haven't figured out how to bridge that difference yet. The beautiful thing is that once you understand the difference between what people say they want and what they actually need, resolution becomes possible." He paused, looking at the camera directly. "My neighbor needed to feel that her concerns mattered. I needed to maintain my right to make decisions about my own property. We both got what we needed because we were both willing to be curious about what the other person was actually asking for underneath the lawsuit. And that's what I want people to understand about conflict resolution. It's not about winning. It's about creating the possibility of connection." He stopped recording. He sat in the garden for a while longer, listening to the fountain, thinking about how far he'd come from the morning when the pool removal truck had first arrived. He thought about how one decision, to remove a pool, had spiraled into a lawsuit, into a documentary, into a career change, into a platform for helping other people navigate their own conflicts. He thought about how Patricia, in suing him, had inadvertently pushed him toward work that seemed to be exactly what he was supposed to be doing all along. He thought about the teenagers he'd spoken to, the HOA board members he'd trained, the couples who'd worked with the Conflict Resolution Center to repair their relationships. He thought about all the ways that one difficult conversation, one moment of choosing compassion over defensiveness, could ripple out and change lives. The garden was beautiful now, mature and well-established. The plants he and Patricia had chosen together had grown stronger over the years. The fountain was still running, still catching light at different times of day. The bench was weathered and worn in exactly the way that meant it had been used, had been sat upon, had been a place where people had thought and rested and maybe, occasionally, solved problems. Marcus realized that the garden had never been just about Patricia. It had been about him. It had been about his need to create something beautiful from a situation that had started painful. It had been about his need to believe that conflicts could be resolved, that neighbors could become something like friends, that fear could be transformed into understanding. He stood up and walked to the gate that separated his yard from where Patricia's house had been. New neighbors lived there now, a young family with kids who sometimes played in the yard. The changes to the neighborhood didn't bother him anymore. Change was inevitable. What mattered was how you responded to it. Marcus walked back toward his house, and as he did, he thought about the journey that one pool removal had set him on. He thought about how the worst things in life were sometimes the doorways to the best things. He thought about how his life was richer because of Patricia's lawsuit, not despite it. And when he looked out at the garden one more time before going inside, he felt something that he hadn't felt in the years immediately after the pool was removed. Peace. Not the peace of victory, not the peace of winning an argument. Just the simple, profound peace of having moved through conflict and emerged on the other side as someone wiser, kinder, and more willing to see the fear underneath other people's anger. The empty space where the pool had been was no longer empty. It was full of meaning, it was full of connection, it was full of possibility. And that, Marcus understood finally, had been the whole point all along.